our final planned webinar in our carbon intensity series, everything leading up to our June 5th TopSoil Summit down here in Southeast Iowa next week. And been saving a very special guest here, Elizabeth Burns-Thompson. Elizabeth, I feel like you're just in on all these key things, like the hottest things that are happening within like policy and ag. Elizabeth Burns-Thompson is going to be there. so I'm glad to have you in on this, and let you kind of maybe introduce yourself a little bit more. I know you've got some material to share with us as well. Some of the topics I want to kind of hit on today, we'll see where all we go with this, but we're going to talk about some of these federal tax credits. We're going to talk about how these different carbon scopes are working and how all of us really tie into the supply chain, how farmers are integrated with all these different supply chains. We're going to definitely talk a lot about renewable fuel supply chains, but these programs are absolutely going to impact all other facets of food and ag as well. So we'll talk about that, and we'll hit on what Navigator is doing specifically here as well. If you've got questions, toss them into the chat and stuff as we go. And we'll definitely have a lot of time to get to additional questions at the end. But without further ado, Elizabeth, let me turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being on and taking the time with us today. Really excited to dig into this with you.
Absolutely. No, I'm happy to be here, and love that I can see kind of the names and some of the faces too that are tuned in here, some familiar faces and names. So good to see all of you. As Mitchell said, my name is Elizabeth Burns-Thompson. I grew up on my family farm in Eastern Iowa. So good things come out of Eastern Iowa, right, Mitchell?
There we go. I guess so. Yeah.
We're actually farmed the northern part of Lynn County, where I grew up. My family still farms there. I went to Iowa State, so again, in good company with that.
Of course.
Very much bleed cardinal and gold, which I know there's some on here that share that sentiment as well. Found my way into the policy space, and I have been very fortunate to be involved in a lot of unique kind of cutting edge things throughout my career, starting very early on with some of the commodity groups and trade associations. So I've worked on policy for the Iowa Farm Bureau Federation, the Iowa Corn Growers Association for a number of years, jumped into then the biodiesel space, working with a renewable energy group, so the largest biodiesel producer in the country, and now getting into the renewable diesel space. And then from there have kind of continued to winnow and jumped into this wild world of wild west of carbon. And so now joined the Navigator team back in July of 2021. I lead all of the kind of government and public affairs, which means if there's a public facing component piece of the project, I'm generally part of it, which definitely has presented some great opportunities.
A little bit of that.
So
keep your hands
like
full
this,
there.
A lot of public meetings and a lot of dialogue with producers and growers all across our footprint, and even beyond about, I think kind of the nuts and bolts of what we'll talk about today is how carbon fits into, pretty much everything that we're doing now and moving forward, and how we can monetize that to our benefit and not our detriment. So with that, I'm pretty laid back too, Mitchell. So I'll let you kind of guide the ship and we'll jump around however you see fit.
Absolutely. So let's kind of hit first on kind of what I was thinking before, maybe explaining kind of what you are seeing from a policy side, especially with some of these new, or not new tax credits, but just adjustments to tax credits, specifically 45Q and 45Z.
Sure. So that is probably the thing that garners, I won't say the most popular headline that we work on and deal with, but certainly tax programs, and especially most recently, some attention to some carbon related tax programs in the United States. Mitchell highlighted both of those. There are, I would say, within the 40 family broadly is a lot of biofuel related as well as carbon related programs. So the biodiesel tax credit falls within that kind of 40, I think it's 40B bucket or 45B bucket as well, and credits related to sustainable aviation fuel. The two that are probably most directly related to what I work on a day-to-day basis is indeed 45Q and 45Z. They are functionally very different and have some history associated with each of them. So 45Q is a program that's actually been around since 2008. It was put in place by under the Bush administration, actually, under a credit value that provided any industrial processor. So that could be an ethanol plant, that could be any type of manufacturer that has a carbon related emission associated with their manufacturing process. And it provided an incentive. I believe the values were $20 a ton back in that day for you to not emit that metric ton of carbon. And otherwise, put it underground, or in that case, many times that was going directly to what we call EOR, enhanced oil recovery. Fast forward to 2018, I believe it was, and I might get my dates mixed up, so please excuse me, but that 45Q was actually expanded underneath the Trump administration. Those values went up to, I believe it was $50 and $35 a ton at that point. And then most recently, under the Biden administration within the Inflation Reduction Act, functionally that tax credit value expanded again to $80 and $65 a ton. And I say those different values because they're tied to what the end application is of that carbon dioxide, that carbon. But again, that credit is measured, think of it on a quantity basis, right? So every ton of carbon that you choose not to emit and otherwise goes into either permanent sequestration and or some type of utilization, further utilization, there is a metric valuation to it on a ton for ton basis for a set number of years. Again, tax credits not in perpetuity, but just basically a 12-year period. What else we got that was somewhat new in the most recent tax package was 45Z, which I know, Mitchell, you spend a lot of time talking about.
It's my favorite.
Personally, I'm very excited about as well, because I think we share the sentiment in that credit actually is one of the first things that's going to unlock value throughout the supply chain and not just at the processor level. So that first credit was industry agnostic, right? If you have a carbon emission and you can quantify it and you can manage it, there's eligibility for that. I'm oversimplifying, but that's for all intensive purposes. When we get into 45Z, though, that only applies to fuel-based manufacturing. And it's measured on a carbon intensity rating as opposed to the metric ton of carbon itself. So it drives not only the activity that I work on a day-to-day basis, right? Capturing that CO2 emission from the source and permanently sequestering it, but it also drives investments into further carbon management techniques that are happening throughout the supply chain, because each one of those fuel manufacturers wants to do more than just reduce their end gallon of ethanol by 30 CI points. They want to do all 50 or 60 because they can further quantify the value of that, because it's effectively each point that you reduce the carbon intensity of that end gallon of fuel, the value of that credit improves. Unfortunately, the window of eligibility for that credit is only 3 years. And I have probably gone in far more detail than anybody wanted on Tax 101 on that, but
no, it's really good stuff. And it's why I wanted to get you in and make sure that everyone is understanding and gathering this correctly. So 45Q is a bunch of different industries, not just ethanol, biodiesel, renewable fuel. That's one of the biggest drivers, but it's not the only one. But it's basically the pipeline project where we can capture that CO2, put it back underground, or use it for otherwise purposes. So it's just stopping that carbon dioxide from being put back up through the smokestack or whatever into the atmosphere. It's just capture that, put it somewhere, get it to use. And that offset of what would have been lost, that reduction, is then what contributes to these credits. So a lot of different industries, but then 45Z factors in that direct capture, but also looks at some of these other scopes. But yeah, it's only renewable fuel. And currently the Inflation Reduction Act says that it'll start after December 31st, 2024, meaning Jan 1st, 2025. And it ends at the end of 2027. So it's only for 2025, 26, and 27, those tax years. So yeah, short term. Now, who knows what's going to happen with it being extended, and 45Q that's been around for longer. It's been adjusted and extended and stuff. So who knows what will happen there? But especially for the farmers that are involved here, if your grain is going into a renewable fuel market, you're part of their scope 3. And that's really what was expanded with the Inflation Reduction Act, is that inclusion of scope 3. Maybe help us explain those scopes a little bit more.
Sure. And I wish I had a little bit of more time to find a good chart for this, but if you think about scopes,
I've got a good one for you.
Okay, good. Cue up my Vanna White moment here. But the scope of the emission, and we talk a lot about either scopes or sometimes life cycles, and it's really relative to what's directly related to what you do on a day-to-day basis, right? What you are responsible for of your activity. So as the chart said, direct emissions, right?
Mhm.
What is it that you burn or you consume or you utilize as part of your day-to-day productions? We get to scope 2, and it's broadening it a little bit further outside of that, right? So it says energy use on here, but so what went into the power that then fueled the tractor that ran the machine and things like that? What was it that went into the grid that powered the generator that did X, Y, or Z? And then scope 3 is even further beyond that, right? So that's anything that's beyond that, kind of indirect, and all of this kind of couples into the broader discussion when we're looking at life cycles. And a life cycle analysis is critically important, because that's how you unlock the value of carbon-based practices throughout the supply chain,
Mhm.
right? And we call it supply chain, they call it life cycle, right? What happens throughout as necessarily seed becomes grain, becomes the
Yeah,
crop that
that
goes to the
bushel
ethanol plant,
or the
right? But
gallon.
looking at it bigger picture, that's something that we all do well, and industry is taking a more whole scale approach on that as well.
Yeah, so we could do, like, the life cycle analysis in this case is the full life cycle of a gallon of ethanol, for example. That 1 gallon of ethanol has a carbon footprint throughout its entire supply chain. It includes how that bushel of corn was produced. That's in the scope 3. It includes how that bushel of corn was turned into ethanol. That's part of the scope 1, and the energy used is part of the scope 2. It also includes that gallon of ethanol has got to get back into the supply chain as well. That's also part of that gallon's carbon footprint. It doesn't just get used at the ethanol plant here somewhere in rural Iowa. It's got to go to a consumer's pump somewhere in the cities or wherever, not necessarily just here locally.
And while scopes, it seemed like somewhat of a foreign concept. I remember when it was first introduced to me, but many of us are used to hearing about low carbon fuel standards or low carbon fuel programs. A plant, I wish they use the vernacular the same from program to program or spot to spot, but basically the different scopes are already encompassed into each plant, ethanol plant or biofuel plant, effectively has a pathway, which means every gallon of fuel that comes out of that facility is given a unique score, right? And that score is based on, as Mitchell just said, all of the unique properties that go into how they go about producing at that facility. What unfortunately to date is part of how we do that math is that effectively, now I'm generalizing, but almost every bushel of grain is given the same score, right? Because they treat a farmer as a farmer as a farmer, and a bushel is a bushel is a bushel. But they don't treat it such that a plant's a plant's a plant, right? Because each ethanol plant, or I should say each facility, has its unique pathway. What we unlock by programs like what we're talking about today, and looking at how we do the math on scoping or pathways, right, is unlocking the opportunity such that no longer does a bushel have to be a bushel does a bushel, right? Because we know that that's not the way that it is, and unlocking that carbon opportunity at that level will, like I said, pull some of that value throughout the supply chain.
Tells the whole story a little bit better. But what I think everyone here, what we're trying to get across is these biofuel companies have to figure out all of these different moving parts here. That full life cycle analysis, they've got to look at their entire footprint And now the opportunity is to utilize these tax credits to help to incentivize lowering from all of these different components. So so what did I do? So lower your footprint directly at your facility, like with a pipeline, lower your footprint by utilizing more renewable energy to reduce your scope 2, or also source low carbon feedstock, like low carbon corn, to produce your ethanol with. And that's where I'm seeing there being big opportunity. But
and I'd say it's not an or. The only thing I would say there, Mitchell, is it doesn't have to be an or. I'd say almost every industry is looking at in an additive fashion, not a one but for the other, right? Reducing
100%.
the emissions of a processing facility coupled with, providing value of reduced emissions associated with everything that goes into that plant is additive, right? And increases value.
So, and I think that's where the current status of this is today, in my view, is all these ethanol, let's think of, a biofuel company, they've got to figure out where are they today, their current life cycle analysis, where are they today, and what's the lowest hanging fruit to work down their overall carbon footprint. And I don't know if it's a standard or if it's just an average, that today the average ethanol plant has a overall carbon intensity of around 56 grams of GHG emissions per megajoule of energy. That's the standard, but the key is 56. That kind of the average one, or that's
I generally round up to 60 just for the ease of doing the math. But I think right about high 50s, mid 60s. And so not just to steal your thunder, but then when you look at what tools are in the toolbox, no different than when you're looking at reducing, if you're a farmer and you're looking at how do I reduce costs on my operation, right? There are things that get you a bigger bang for your buck, right? They have a bigger impact, and some that are more marginal gains. When we look at when a plant is looking at specifically reducing emissions or that decarbonization potential, they cut that score in half. So we reduce through carbon capture and sequestration, you reduce that by 30 CI points. Now that will necessarily be coupled with, as we've talked about, a lot of these other things that you're seeing here on the diagram, along with optimizations, as well as better quantification of carbon back to the farm. And that's truly how you reach net zero.
Yeah. So that average, what you're getting at there is that average plant today, 56, 60 for the easier math. You can capture your emissions at the plant and cut your score in half, 30-point reduction, just that one change. Here you were going to emit all this carbon, capture that, you cut your footprint in half. Do we know what the typical plant could even kind of get out of reducing their scope 2? Like probably more in the 5 to 10 point range is what I've seen. Is that sound about right?
There are plants out there that are making investments that will get them to net zero, if not net negative, far before the 2030 or 2050 metrics that are the goals that the industry has set for itself. So when you're talking about, and this isn't new novel technology, this isn't something that needs to be commercialized in order for it to come to fruition. There is a pathway forward for us to get to net zero, net negative, long before we could get, enough EV chargers and things like that put in, and the infrastructure updates that are necessary to meet it via those types of tactics, which I think is a pretty exciting thing, right? And that's when you're letting technology truly compete. It's, the best technology kind of comes to fruition first. And so you're allowing a lot of those pieces to come forward. But yes, you'll have a lot that will effectively cut it overnight. The other thing that I wanted to jump into, because I know we talk a lot about fuel, one of the other pieces I'm really excited about is we have 31 processors on our footprint. And at some point we'll bring up a map of what our footprint looks like for those that aren't familiar. But we've got 31 plants committed to be part of our management platform, also known as a pipeline. But one of those is an ammonia facility. And so if you also look at what is the largest piece, and Mitchell, you know this as well as anybody, but the largest piece of the carbon score associated with the farm production practices, it's largely in the fertilizer bucket. And so we are able to utilize a technology to not only reduce the carbon intensity of what is the biggest piece of the farm-based CI score via carbon capture, right? That's then now proactively reducing, along with everything else, be it different tools and techniques, right, on the farm to reduce the CI score of that end bushel. Well, that bushel is hopefully then going into further manufacturing and processing that's likely also coupled with carbon capture that is also benefiting from that technology. And there's not a whole lot of things in production agriculture that have that type of cyclical value add. And so it's something that I'm personally really excited about.
Yeah. So for everyone here, hopefully you're kind of picking up what we're putting down. We're talking about a lot of different stuff here. That the key, though, boils down to these companies can now earn value and credit by reducing all the different levers within their supply chain. Scope 1, their direct emissions. Scope 2, their renewable energy and stuff. Scope 3, their supply chain. All the cards are on the table. And at least for renewable fuel companies using 45Z can look at all of them and be able to monetize that right now. But yeah, to your point, it's now beyond. So we showed this in a previous webinar where in the farm carbon scoring system called GREET, there's certain parameters that move the needle more than others. And one of those parameters is by reducing your synthetic fertilizer. But also now what we're talking here is it could not only be just less synthetic fertilizer that I use, but also that unit of synthetic nitrogen could also be lower carbon because its emissions are captured here as well. So we're looking even at my scope 3 emissions of me as a farmer. The product that I buy and put onto my farm could also be lower carbon. So it's even looking beyond, just the amount of fertilizer that we put on, but looking at how it's produced. They call it what green ammonia is another thing, blue ammonia. We've talked about that in the past as well, but basically for the farmer being able to look very holistically at all their farming practices, their reduced tillage, their cover crop, their reduced fertilizer, all of these items are in play. And all of them can be utilized to help you to lower your footprint, therefore lowering the footprint of renewable fuel or whatever marketplace you are associated with.
And I think you said it there, right, Mitchell. It's while renewable fuels is kind of the key focus for a lot of this right now, in large part, that's frankly because we have carbon-based programs that exist in the fuel space, and they have for a number of years. To say that we won't have a carbon-based metric on other goods, services, products, I think is a misnomer. There is going to be, I've said it before, carbon is going to continue to be a quantifiable characteristic that's going to determine the value of goods and service that we bring to market, not just transportation fuels and not just ag products, but it will be part of that building block of a lot of different things. And so no different than we see calories listed on packaging or things like that. I do believe we're going to get to a point where there's a CI score on a number of different things, if not everything at some point. And so it's important, one, that how we do the math, right? So the models that go into it and that those are built fair, but then also that we're taking the time to take advantage of, participating in all of those pieces of the supply chain.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And part of it being that other industries are going to have to figure out how to kind of connect. Yeah, this carbon intensity, how I think about it is it's basically it's your digital asset that's associated with the physical asset. And I think that it's going to be not just carbon impact, but biodiversity, water quality, water utilization, like some of these other environmental outcomes will probably also be tied together. It's just that here we've got a little bit more developed business model that's going to drive carbon drawdown and carbon reduction within renewable fuel. So going back to something you were talking about before, okay, so we've got the full impact of a ethanol company or a renewable fuel company has all this different carbon impact But how these scores work for them today is they've got to get below 50. And to your point, a lot of companies are at 60 today. This Inflation Reduction Act 45Z says you got to be below 50 or you get nothing. So if they're at 60 today, they got to get 10 points reduced before they can even qualify. Some plants are doing better. Some plants are a little bit closer, got some newer plants or more efficiencies, or just by the nature of their energy source or whatever. But nonetheless, companies have to figure out how to get below 50 before they can even start to capitalize. And yeah, they can do that with the pipeline projects, direct capture, cut your carbon intensity by 30 points, like we were talking earlier, maybe some efficiencies within energy. But back to where we want to help is farmers. Let's figure out how to reduce out of the grain itself. The issue there is that it's not just a one and done, here's a pipeline, we know exactly what it is, but now we have to deal with all these moving parts, all these farmers that are in the supply chain, all these fields, all these bushels, all with a different carbon intensity score. And I think that's kind of scary for a lot of these groups. But what are you seeing as groups are evaluating what should they do from a scope 3 reduction perspective?
So I will tell you, I've on our footprint specifically, we have some of the largest in the business and some of the smaller independent shops. And I will tell you, they're looking at everything. And it's a function of, yes, tax policies and incentives, but also if you take a step back and think about where we send our end products, right? So who is our customer at the end of the day? Our largest marketplace domestically for ethanol right now is California and predominantly the West Coast broadly, right? But they have the largest pool of vehicles and they have the largest pool of fuel consumption. Our largest market internationally for ethanol is Canada. One thing that those two states or countries, I should say, have in common is both of them have a carbon-based metric that determines the value of all fuel, not just ethanol, but all fuels units that are coming into that marketplace. And so we are having to compete. Our customers are saying carbon is something that's important and we are willing to pay for it based on how it scores. And it will compete against, right? Ethanol is coming there and competing against diesel and biodiesel and renewable diesel and electricity and hydrogen and whatever else they're going to come up with next, right? But it is somewhat technology agnostic, but it necessarily carbon is the competing value, and it's something that marketplaces are having to pay attention to.
It's really interesting. So the low carbon fuel markets is what you're talking about there. These low carbon fuel markets, like what you said, California, Oregon, Washington. I think those are only 3 that are fully locked in the U.S., right? Those 3 states, California, Oregon,
California
Washington.
was the first program here in the States. Oregon passed theirs and Washington has theirs. There has been quite a bit of conversation out on the East Coast as well.
Yeah.
I've participated in conversations in Minnesota. I think there's had some conversations in Colorado and Illinois. But yes, and I will tell you, so also I actually just got back here this last weekend from being overseas with the U.S. Grains Council. And part of that that mission was talking to really an international transportation forum. And we had representatives of a broad mix of the supply chain, all the way from the farm gate up to the processor to myself from a value added technology, all the way to technologies that are improving the amount of ethanol that can go into these into the end users fuel tanks. And so what we've heard time and time again was, well, what does that mean for carbon? Markets internationally are looking at it as a metric of value, and so this just frankly isn't going away.
Yeah.
And it's okay, right? Because push comes to shove, American agriculture is incredibly competitive when it comes to carbon.
Yeah, no, and we know that we can continue to expand, but also I think we have to keep in mind here too that we're producing fuel with these grains, but also there's a lot of byproducts and stuff that go back into other verticals and stuff as well. That interested from a policy standpoint, we'll get back into that of what's kind of shaping up there. But yeah, interesting to see Canada as a entire country already has their low carbon fuel markets. The 3 states on the West Coast, then those are continuing to expand. But from a policy perspective, those can be stacked with these federal credits. Is that correct? Where basically you're able to earn like a premium on the low carbon fuel, but also earn tax credits. Is that how this is going to shape up?
Yeah, in certain programs, there is opportunities to stack. And stack, I don't want to make it seem like, although it's duplicative, right? It's different programs existing in different places. And, we have that in other iterations of incentive structures, right? It's driving demand to come into certain localities. So there is certainly some triggers if fuels go outside of the United States, right? So it's hard to comply then for domestic level blending programs if we're shipping it to Canada or Japan or India or places like that. But things that are used in this country that could qualify for a federal program, be it 45 to 45Z, could potentially then be stacked with a credit valuation that would be within the LCFS of California or one of those other programs. What likely would not stack then is valuation that exists then in the voluntary carbon market, right? So making sure that there is integrity on the value of that carbon is incredibly important. And there are more than a number of kind of certification entities that help make sure that there's integrity in that, right? So that if it's being retired into an established carbon market or carbon program like the LCFS, that it isn't duplicated into one of the many kind of voluntary programs that exist out there. But that also, provides optionality for businesses and consumers and things like that to be able to have, not everything has to go to an LCFS facing marketplace, right? You can still monetize value into one of the many voluntary programs on top of then also the federal incentives that exist. And again, I want to take a step back. One last thing on those federal incentives. A lot of those are put in place truly to help those processors cost share what are rather substantial investments that they're making into their businesses, right? Sure. This is it's not cheap to install the blowers and the compressors and install all the added equipment at each of those ethanol plants or fuel processing facilities. Additionally, we all pay property taxes, so too do those plants, and every equipment addition that they add into that boosts the ongoing value of their site, which is great for our local communities, right? Don't get me wrong, boosting that property tax base is great for those small towns that those ethanol plants exist in, but that is a cost that they have to add to their balance sheet. So we're all businesses at the end of the day, and so it's got to make economic sense for it to be sustainable, right? Sustainability is just as much environmental and economic.
It's a really good point too on how that's going to impact on the farm. If we're making more money by selling into some of these low carbon marketplaces, now we've got more taxable income that we've got to figure out what to deal with as well. We've also got more income coming into farms. It's going to continue to drive up the price of stuff. I mean, we've been here, done this with renewable fuels and with some of these markets that are regulated, and there's federal tax impact. There has been in renewable fuel for years. This is nothing brand new. It's just pushing it to that next step even further. So, but you brought up something really interesting, and a question that we've gotten multiple different times. If a farmer is involved in one of these voluntary carbon offset marketplaces today, like just for example, just thinking of some random ones, but SIBO, Indigo Ag, Nori or Land O'Lakes or whoever, if they're involved in one of those carbon programs that's in utilizing Vera as the international registry, are they able to still participate in some of these low carbon fuel supply chains as well? Or do we know if they can participate in a voluntary market for their practices and a scope 3 reduction place? Can they do both?
Sure. So that's something you'll have to work with each of your individual processors with. I will say that you kind of hit the nail on the head of that aggregation of what is sometimes hundreds of farmers that are fueling or that are bringing supply into one of these facilities, right? Being able to make sure that the accounting matches up for these programs is incredibly complex. But I don't want to speak for any one of our individual plants directly, but I know that they are looking at and have run trials with a number of the different kind of certifying entities to figure out a good general way to try to make some simplicity to it. But yeah, I think there's opportunities so that you don't have to be pigeonholed into one program or this and then be excluded, from participating in others. So I think it's good that we have a lot of different entities coming forward, because that's frankly how the industry does grow, and you figure out ultimately what makes the most sense.
Well, I just see that there being just so much opportunity here that we need everybody at the table anyway. And we just need some clarity on how these rules are going to shape up. And I know that there's progress being made in DC. They're talking about this. The IRS said something probably a couple of weeks ago here now, a month ago or so, that they were looking at some of these credits and trying to figure out some of the protocol to it. But I mean, it's going to be a while before the dust settles on this. What needs to be done next from like a policy standpoint to keep this going and get us some clarity here?
Yes, and Laura actually had sent a direct message and asked about kind of how the calculation was going to work. Like I said, there's artfulness in how we do the math, because math can make it fair and math can make it not fair. And so the Department of Treasury is tasked with, go back to, I'm just a bill, right? Bill becomes law. That's not where it stops, right? You have to interpret said law and put regulations and further define functionally how that law will be put into practice. And that's why we have administrative agencies. That's why we have a USDA, we have an EPA. And that's also why we have a Department of Treasury, is they take what Congress has passed and then put in place kind of the rules of the road of how ultimately it will be implemented, and further define things that aren't, exceptionally clear in the legislation itself. So that's my long way of saying that the Department of Treasury right now is working through development of their guidance documents that will help guide, how critical terms are defined, how we do calculations on things, the models sometimes that are being used. So Mitchell, you'd mentioned GREET. GREET is a very well established. I think the industry in the United States is pretty well coalesced around, Argonne GREET as the best model to lean on. There is a little bit of kind of conflict as we get into SAF, or sustainable aviation fuel, and some of the international markets that are using another model, an ICAO model, or what they call CORSIA, I think is what it's called. There's acronym soup for anything under the sun, I tell you.
We've thrown out a lot of acronyms in this whole thing. We need like we gotta have an interpretation here of all these acronyms. But these different models, something that's what they still got to figure out. But this Argonne GREET tool, which is what we've built into our TopSoil software, and we've automated connectivity with GREET, because that is what it currently states that in the Inflation Reduction Act. But yeah, to your point, we still got to figure out how the nuances of the rules are going to work. But that GREET tool from the U.S. Department of Energy in one of their labs, like that's what is most likely anyway. That's what's been indicated that that's what they're going to use. And it's
the making sure that it becomes the full application of GREET, right? Because you can turn a level here, tweak a little thing over here, and again, there's art in how you do the math and how those models are structured.
So everyone knows what she's getting at on that. One of the things that, to my understanding, what they're debating on is, should they utilize GREET, but then should they allow for the soil organic carbon components to be included? Meaning, should they allow for using cover crops, using no-till? Should they allow for that to be included in the scoring system, or will they only look at your reduction in nitrogen, fuel usage, energy usage? Okay, so it's kind of this one's a little bit more known because it's an actual unit of the fertilizer or the input that, it's going to take some time to track and to be able to document and stuff, but the impact is a little bit more known than just cover crop. But my push is, hey, if the federal government wants to incentivize decarbonizing, why wouldn't they want all the options on the table? Is the soil organic carbon components within GREET, is it perfect? Not even close. But it's a huge driver to enable the adoption of no-till and cover crop, or reduced till at least. Huge driver to your point system to incentivize using no-till and cover crops, which of course, we know, and a lot of you that on this webinar that follow us, that we can see benefit in using cover crops in more than just decarbonizing that supply chain, but the water quality benefits and weed suppression, other stuff as well. But it sounds like from a federal side though, Elizabeth, like the law is due to go, like the credits are due to go into play basically January 1st, 2025. So I think the concern is we're not going to know the rules until it's going to be really close to that date. And then we're going to be like, what do we do? Like, is there any indication that we can get some rulings quicker, or are we basically just kind of sit around and continue to wait?
So your comment before about, it's not perfect. Nothing that comes out of DC is perfect, and nothing that comes out of DC is fast. So we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good or progress. But that won't keep us from continuing to fight to make sure that things are fair and fair for Midwestern production ag. But yeah, it does seem challenging to look back and think that we can put something into place, a little over a year ago, I should say Congress did, and that it would take 3 to 5 years in order for them to figure out what it is that they wrote, and then implement it into a program, because we also have companies out there that are trying to make investment decisions, in part, not only from an incentive structure perspective, right? So just the sheer rules of the road from the directives from Congress, but many of these entities have made market facing pledges in and of themselves, right? I can't think of anyone in the ethanol industry that hasn't made the pledge to be net zero by 2050, right? So they're already in looking at how do we make these large scale investments to meet the promises that they've made, to be it shareholders, to their customers, to the marketplace broadly, right? And so there is a little bit of unknown still out there, but I think that you're seeing a lot of investments in, back to our very first point, the pieces of the pie up front that they know give the biggest quantifiable difference, that there's some certainty on. And as we get additional clarity, that perspective is only going to continue to grow, and it's going to trickle down even further through the supply chain.
Yeah, it's going to be, and to like we've been talking, it's not just going to be renewable fuels, but all these other supply chains, all these different claims about decarbonizing. Yeah, this 45Z and 45Q tax credit could enable it to speed up and get a lot of dollars brought into the system and make this really rock and roll. But also it's the core thesis behind this that is for sure, in my like the thesis of documenting how you produce your product, whether it be corn and soybeans, a gallon of milk, a gallon of ethanol, whatever you're producing, document what you're doing, run the environmental models on those, knowing that the models are going to continue to adjust and improve. You're probably going to have to get that third party verified. And then there's probably going to be some supply chain opportunities, and where that story is going to be connected in the supply chain and enable that market to go. But yeah, I mean, where do you see as the opportunity, I guess, now for folks that are listening in, to continue to move and position themselves to succeed? Because some of these market, like if it is a tax credit thing, like it can be a short-term window that we've got to capitalize on this, and we got to make sure that we're sitting there ready to rock and roll when the time is right. But what do you think we need to be doing here now?
Sure. So I if I was sitting in your shoes as a producer, I would be having some pretty direct conversations with the folks that you sell your grain or basically any of your end products to, because I do think that we're going to see some growth in this, as you talked about, in the meat sector as well. But get yourself up to speed with the commitments and the processes that they're putting into place, because I think you'd be surprised how much of the industry is already looking at this or is already made investments in terms of proactive infrastructure that they're putting in place to make sure that they're frankly carbon competitive. I do love alliteration a little bit as well. But you are a critical piece as a producer to making sure that that's successful. And so getting a fulsome understanding of what they're looking at down the road, but then also I'd say being part of the programs and the practices that they're looking to put into place, because frankly, you're going to be the one that gets to deal with it, right? As those things are kind of becoming more commercialized. And so making sure that it's ease of use, because it's a lot more accounting, but it doesn't have to be tough and it doesn't have to be difficult. And frankly, it can be value added. And the best way I think that happens is being proactively part of the dialogue and the conversation upfront. And I would say that both with your day-to-day, right, from your farm to your point of sale, but then also, this is my own selfish plug here, but begin to read up on some of the more tangential pieces, like what the processors are doing kind of post the farm gate, right? To further improve their market access and things like that, be it the carbon management, pipeline projects like what we're working on. And I would challenge everyone to read a little bit more than just the headlines, and frankly, ask some tough questions, but really get to the root of why it is that some of these things are taking place. And I assure you it's far more complex than what you might be reading on the news. So
yeah, a lot of moving parts to it. And I think what folks have to really figure out, and you and I have had this conversation before, that we need some clarity around like how the dollars are going to work here too, that I see this as being just huge dollars for family farms that are directly participating in these markets, but also these local, like from a county and a city tax perspective, from a jobs perspective, from a overall GDP of the Midwest and of US agriculture overall, but also just as a telling our story of agriculture better. And that there's going to be more and more electric and hybrid vehicles and stuff, but hey, we can decarbonize these fuels that we're putting into our tanks as well and continue to use the current infrastructure. It's just going to be all these different options on the table, and farmers need to understand that. I've got a question then. I like Laura's thought here in the chat as well, but question on like what percentage of farmers do you view, Elizabeth, that actually like are grasping this and understanding what this opportunity is here so far? And my answer is a small. I mean, I feel like I'm really just getting a grasp on it. Like I don't know if 5 or 10% would really have a decent grasp on like what is happening here. I think people are interested. We're getting good, attendance at webinars and our events, and like the interest and stuff is there, but grasping how big of an opportunity this is, I think we're really early into that conversation.
So I would agree. And I think having done nearly 100 public town halls and meetings related to our project specifically, I think the root of it is that carbon is incredibly difficult to conceptualize, right? Because we don't see it, we don't touch it, we don't feel it, right? We don't interact with it unless you've got a bubbly beverage in front of you, right? Like we don't otherwise maybe see it. Excuse me. But what we're used to seeing, right, is when you take in a load of grain into your first purchaser, be it the ethanol plant or the co-op or whatnot, right? You can physically tell if that load of grain is wet, right? Or if it's dirty, or if it's damaged, right? Those are also quantifiable characteristics that determine the value of that commodity that you just brought to market. The thing about those is you can see those with the naked eye for the most part. Carbon is much the same way. It is a quantifiable characteristic that is going to determine the value of whatever the commodity is, be it that end bushel of grain or that end gallon of ethanol that is coming to market. The thing about it is if I put a high CI bushel of grain in front of you and a low CI bushel of grain in front of you, to the naked eye, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Generally. I've not tested that out scientifically, so take me at my word there, but I'm pretty sure we wouldn't be able to tell the difference, right? So that is really tough because we're used to things that we can see, touch, feel, interact with, but that doesn't mean that it negates the value. And again, that's why I highlight, we have our biggest marketplaces right now. Our customers are saying this is an important characteristic that we will pay for.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. And that's what we're telling farmers is let's figure out what your actual score of that is, since it does have a lot of moving parts to it. You got to factor in fuel usage, yield, your tillage, your cover crop, your fuel usage, fertilizer usage, like you got to manure, you got to factor in everything. And we've automated that process now. We publicly will launch all that on Monday, but being able to get growers that score, because like to the point of Laura and Brad in the chat, we need to make sure the farmers are in position to capitalize on this, which means for sure your 2024 crop is going to be subject to these credits, which means you better have a plan come this fall. But the and best I'm hearing so already here, Elizabeth, is up to 40 cents per bushel for carbon for CI zero corn. 40 cents a bushel type of premium to do this stuff. And I think that we are just getting started. We're hearing about a penny, 2 pennies, 5 pennies, 10 cents a bushel. Now getting close to 40 cents on that. Like it's a big opportunity here to make sure that our farmers are in position to be able to capitalize. And these ethanol plants, like they got to get this going now.
And it's yes. And I think the other thing in addition to being able to kind of conceptualize it is distinguishing the fact that just because we might not think of it as a characteristic that we would pay for, right? When I go up to the fuel tank, right, like I look for the highest ethanol blend because that's something that's important to me. I don't necessarily buy based on a carbon metric. But just because, you or I or those of us on this webinar here might not look at carbon as something that we would delineate the value of that end product on, doesn't mean that there isn't consumers out there that are doing that. So again, being responsive
consumers, but these companies that have already made the pledge saying that they're going to do it. Like it's not even, it's just going to be what the option is. It's just going to be, here's what we're selling you, because there's only so many pumps at that, or only so many different nozzles at that pump.
And it will trickle, like I said, I mentioned before about, into other sectors, especially into ag, right? We call them ethanol plants. I think it's a bit of a misnomer, right? At any one point in time, there's a number of different value added products coming out of that facility, be it the corn oil that is, putting on my old biodiesel hat. A lot of that corn oil found its way into a lot of the biodiesel plants that I used to help oversee, and will be destined to be the biodiesel or renewable diesel. Yep. And then you have the distillers grain markets that's going into livestock feed. And when that producer or when that processor reduces the carbon intensity via whatever technology that they put on, right, that doesn't just limit or reduce the CI of that end gallon of ethanol. It's everything that comes out of that facility. So those of you that are on this call here that are in the meat sector, there absolutely will be a day where someone wants the low carbon, no carbon T-bone or pork chop, and you or I might not pay for it, but there is somebody out there that will, and we are going to be the most well suited to be able to meet that customer demand.
Well, and I'm sold that it's not necessarily going to be the end consumer that's going to want it. It's going to be the finance sector that's already pledged that they're going to do it, and these companies that have already pledged that they're going to do it. It's not even necessarily going to be a choice. It's just going to be what it is. But a quick other question. We're running out of time already. I feel like we saw a lot that we could hit on. We'll have to. I'm sure we don't have our plans put together on what webinars we're going to do, but I'm sure in another couple months, we're definitely going to need to get you guys back in. But a quick one, what do we know what the projection for ethanol demand is going to be like in California or in other markets, like with all these other alternative renewable energy sources and stuff? Like what's the long-term viability of just ethanol look like?
Sure. $1 million question. I get that almost every meeting is well, aren't we all going electric, right? We're all going to drive a Tesla. I assure you I will not, but there will be absolutely more electric vehicles on the road. And just like I said, it's a bit of misnomer that we call an ethanol plant an ethanol plant. It would also be a misnomer for us to think about the trajectory of the ethanol industry just for passenger vehicles, because the investments in the technology that is being looked at right now, there's an untapped potential in a number of other sectors where we use liquid fuels. Aviation fuel is probably the one that's rising to the top right now. But we use liquid fuels in trains. We use them in container ships. There is a variety of places that, again, use some pretty dirty fuels right now that are or very just marginal percentage of renewables that present a great opportunity for ethanol. And I think you're seeing investments being made, ethanol to jet, really all around the world. And it was a key topic. I'll tell you, when I was overseas, everyone wants to talk about sustainable aviation fuel. And
Wow.
there's a great opportunity for that to come from corn-based ethanol, but it's got to have a low CI.
Yeah. Got to have a low carbon intensity to it. Got to be able to be at huge scale. I mean, the quantity that we're talking on this stuff is just astronomical. So
Absolutely.
Elizabeth, we've gotten into a bunch of stuff, a bunch of things that we like kind of had on the list we didn't get to. I hope everyone's gotten some value out of this. We're up on the hour. Any kind of parting thoughts on your side? I mean, we didn't even hardly get into like what Navigator is really doing. We kind of hit on it. You guys are tied in with like the pipeline, helping companies navigate this overall.
Yeah, no, I do want to be cognizant of time and keeping folks, diligent on the hour. I did drop my email address into the chat, as well as our project website. I see some familiar faces on here, so some of that shouldn't be new to many of them. But if folks have questions about it, I'd love to have a conversation. Shoot me an email and we'll find some time to chat. And our website is a wealth of information about kind of the who, what, where, when, and how on what we're developing. And I'd really encourage folks to reach out and we'll chat further.
Fantastic. Let me supposed to have my final slide here. I'm supposed to have up right here. So with that, just thank everyone for taking the time, Elizabeth, especially to you. A lot of different stuff, a lot to try to cram in, but I hope people got good value out of this. We're going to be this is our final one of these webinars. Like I've said, we're hosting our conference on Monday, where we're definitely going to be hitting on a lot more of this type of topic. We still got spots if you want to come down on June 5th. We'll do some more webinars here after. I've got to go help my wife have a kid and stuff though. And so maybe after that at some point in like July or another time this summer, we will pick things back up. But in the meantime, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We'll get this recording up on our YouTube channel here in the coming couple days. And we will talk to everybody again later on.